everyone. Welcome to another Greenville County Library System virtual event. My name is Rachel and I'm the Adult Outreach and Event Coordinator for this library system. And I'm so glad you could join us tonight. We're going to be talking about chills and thrills, why we can't get enough scary films. We're going to be joined by producer, director, and professor Jeffrey Cooper of Cut Entertainment Group in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to remind you all to first, get a library card if you don't already have one. That's your ticket to so many free resources, databases, and so many activities. Also, if you want to stay in the know for great events like this one, check out greenvillelibrary.org/events. That's our online event calendar. You can check out events for children through adults, and whether it's indoor, outdoor, or virtual like this, you can have access to all of those there. Put those on your calendar. We'd like to welcome our special guest today. Jeffrey Cooper is the owner of the production and distribution company Cut Entertainment Group, which in the nearly 2 decades that they've been in business has licensed over 1,000 horror films around the world. In addition to this work on features and documentaries, Mr. Cooper has also taught courses at colleges and universities across the country, including, of course, courses on horror films. So we're fortunate to have him speak with us tonight. He holds an MA in film and video from the School of Communication at American University. All right, without further ado, let's get started discussing horror and thriller films. Jeffrey Cooper, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Greetings and salutations, everyone. So just to sort of piggyback on what Rachel was saying, I'm an adjunct cinema professor. I've been teaching for since 2007. And basically what I teach is heavily involved in what my company is. And the main part of the company is licensing feature films around the world. As she said, we have sold close to about 150 films since its inception about almost 20 years ago. So we're going to talk about a couple things today, but before I sort of start with that, I just want to quickly get into 2 stories that I guess really decided for me that I wanted to, be in this crazy movie industry and be involved in horror films and this and that. And the first one is that I started getting interested in horror films when I started to make these like little horror films when I was like 8 or 9 years old. And then my folks took me to see this movie starring Michael Caine and Angie Dickinson. I don't know raise your hand if you've seen it. It's called Dressed to Kill, back in the mid to late 70s. Anybody see a movie called Dressed to Kill? Okay, if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth seeing. Michael Caine is the psychiatrist and Angie Dickinson is a patient. And there's one particular scene where Angie Dickinson goes to a hotel to meet this stranger, and they make love in the hotel, and then she leaves. She's married, and then halfway down the elevator, she realized she left her wedding ring up in the guy's room, and then she goes back up, but on the way up, the elevator then rings and the door opens, and standing there is this blonde woman with a dark leather jacket and a straight razor. And this psychopath then basically brutally murders Angie Dickinson in the elevator. And it was a really shocking scene, totally freaked me out. And what I didn't know at the time is that it was Michael Caine dressed as a woman, and just super creepy. And I said to myself, I can't take this anymore. I got to get out of here. And I said, well, I'm going to go into a different theater. Maybe there's like a good family movie or feel-good film that I can go into that'll bring me a little bit down, make me a little less, scared. So then lo and behold, I see the name of this film, and it was called Alien, okay, back in 1979. Raise your hand if you've seen Alien. Okay, some people have seen Alien. So I'm thinking, hey, it's a nice family movie, Alien. It's probably animated, about an alien that comes to set. Well, anyway, as you know, no, it definitely was anything but animated and it was definitely non-family film. Not even terrified me even more. So I knew at that point that, I love this stuff. I want to perhaps do something in films. And then there's another sort of more lighthearted story where in 1978, I went to see Kramer versus Kramer, okay, with Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep. And it was like one of those like threeplexes where it was like three cinemas in this one big building. And what I didn't know was that the theater next to us, they were playing one of the Dawn of the Dead movies, you know, big crazy zombie film. So, but I got a notice on here. Let me just take care of this. Okay. So I'm watching Kramer versus Kramer, and it's a very serious film. And there's a particular scene at the end where Meryl Streep comes back and tells Dustin Hoffman she's about to take custody. She's about to tell him that she can't take their son because there's on the ceiling, there's certain wallpaper in Dustin Hoffman's house that has to do with clouds and spaceships and flowers. And the son grew up with that. And there's no way in the world that her house can compare to the joy that he had as the child while the child was growing up. And it was the saddest scene. And they're crying, they're both crying. And there was one instance where there's like 20 minutes of complete silence on the screen. And the theater is completely silent. There's not a dry eye in the house. And then all of a sudden, we then from next door, because the acoustics are awful, hear the sounds of these crazy zombies screaming at the top of their lungs while I'm watching this Kramer versus Kramer movie. So if you could try to imagine a really sad scene of Kramer versus Kramer, and then we're all hearing this next door, and it sounds like the following. Kind of crazy. And everyone is just cracking up in the theater. So at that point, I knew then that there's definitely something to this. And I got to do something in horror pictures. So what we're going to do now is kind of focus on horror films itself. We're going to talk about, to a certain degree, the psychology of it and how it evolved. But before we get into that, there's no disputing the fact that one of the reasons that horror movies are so popular is because there's so many subcategories of different horror films. I mean, it's not like if you go see a drama, then there's different subcategories of drama. In horror films, there's so many different types of horror films. So I want to first throw this out to anyone who could potentially answer this question, which is, do you know some of the subgenres of horror films? And I've already mentioned like at least one of them, which is Alien. In that case, it's a space horror. That's what Alien is. It's space horror. But anyone want to take a, pardon the pun, a stab at it? You know, who can create? Come tell us what are some of the other subgenres of horror pictures?
Serial killer.
Ah, very good. Yeah, serial killer. Leaning along the lines of like psychological. Very, very good. Anybody else?
Like man versus nature films. So like
yeah,
Anaconda.
Yeah. What'd you say? What was the film?
Anaconda.
Yeah. And snakes. Yeah, Anaconda. That could also fall under like animal horror kind of thing, where it's like whether it's a dog, as in Cujo or stuff like that.
We've got an answer in the chat for paranormal.
The what?
An answer in the chat is paranormal.
Yes, paranormal horror, absolutely. Paranormal activity, definitely ghost horror, definitely, comes into play when we're talking ghost horror. There's also alien invasion horror. And the interesting thing about alien invasion is that it's not something that necessarily has to take place in space. Alien invasion can take place on Earth, such as like Independence Day. There's also a great movie, I don't know if anyone's seen it, but in the 50s, there was a movie called The Thing from Another World, which was also called The Thing, starring James Arness, which was a great film. And then in the early 80s, John Carpenter remade The Thing. in the early 80s, and that was called, ironically enough, The Thing. So that's another definite category. Just to name a couple other ones, home invasion horror, body cam found footage horror, witchcraft horror, zombie horror, apocalyptic horror, doll horror. One of my old favorites, demented family horror, demented children. I mean, who doesn't like a movie about a demented family? I mean, come on. I mean, you can't buy anything better than that. And I've actually, in the last couple of weeks, kind of come up with a different one. And I call it like game show horror or games horror, because I caught this series on Netflix that I thought was really interesting. And maybe you all know what it is. It's, you know what it is, Heather?
Squid Games?
Yeah, the Squid Game. So if anyone's not seen the Squid Game, I would definitely recommend that you go check it out. Game horror also falls under the category of Saw, which is kind of like, where the characters have to play a game, otherwise they're going to die. So there's no shortage of subgenres, which is why horror films, I think, to a certain degree, are so popular and successful. But it then begs the question of, why do we like going to horror films? What are the psychological reasons of why people like to see horror movies? Why do they like to be scared? So I kind of want to, again, bring this out to you all out there, in addition to, anyone who I can't see, who's perhaps typing, and kind of pose the question as to, why do you think it is that people go to see these movies? And obviously, they have to enjoy them, otherwise they wouldn't be there. So from a psychological perspective, let's take a quick run at that. Anyone want to throw an answer out there?
Adrenaline?
Well, okay, there you go. Adrenaline, that we get like this, like adrenaline rush that we go in there. You can equate it to like, well, why in the world do we like to go on roller coasters? Why do we go on to theme parks? I mean, what kind of a nut would go bungee jumping? I mean, that is something actually that probably I wouldn't do. But why do we do that? It's because it gives us this like adrenaline rush that we really sort of love. And that's something that's so interesting. And that kind of goes hand in hand also with the concept of, people love feeling an adrenaline rush when they know they're not going to, or they like putting themselves in dangerous situations, feeling the adrenaline rush when they know that they're not in a dangerous situation. So for example, if you're in a movie theater, you know that you're safe. But what's interesting with a horror film is that the way that the brain works when we're watching horror pictures is that our mind has like chemicals that have like two separate results in a way. There's the one part of the brain that results in the physiological reaction that we're getting when we're watching a horror film, the adrenaline rush. That results in the heart beating, that results in the blood pressure going up, and that's the rush that we get. And then of course, if it's a really good horror film, you might just be feeling that because for a second, you might actually think that this is not false, that you might actually think it's happening to you. But then, of course, the other part of the brain comes into play, and that's the reason part, where we come to the realization that, come on, you're in a theater, you're safe, and that's why you're going to really enjoy this horror picture, because nothing is going to happen to you. So those things, I think, are one of the main reasons why we love, psychologically, why we like going to the horror films, because we're in a safe environment and we can control it. And the rush is definitely a very, very important aspect of it. Another thing that I wanted to bring up also is that of all the genres, horror films are, or I should say, the fear is the most communal emotion that people love to share with audiences. You're going to a drama, you're not really going to be scared. You're in a comedy, you're not, you're going to laugh. And that's not to say that all the time you're going to laugh at a comedy club. Sometimes you'll be in a comedy club and not everyone's going to laugh. Sometimes you'll be watching a drama and everyone might think it's kind of sappy, but they're not going to be crying or really upset. But if you're in the woods with your friends or family and you start to hear the sound of a chainsaw, and then you see someone in the shadows running toward you, I'd pretty much bet that everyone's going to get the heck out of there pretty darn quickly. So that's what I mean when I say that fear remains one of the best shared audiences, one of the best shared emotions with audiences. And I also think that it's important that we understand that from a not only feeling alive as a result of that, but there's also another aspect that has to do with the communal feeling about it. And that is that you enter a movie when you go see a horror film, most of the time with strangers. But what's interesting is that by the time that that horror film is over, you're pretty coming out, not only with your friends, but you're coming out a lot of times with a lot of buddies and other friends, because you're experiencing this like adrenaline rush together. And I think that if you take it a step further, that provides us an element of social acceptance, that we go to this with our friends because we all want to be socially accepted. And we seek social acceptance in anything that we do. You know, we want to be socially accepted. So I think the camaraderie aspect of the psychological aspect of desiring camaraderie, I think is a very important reason why we also go to horror films, because we're accepted among our peers, because we all love it. And of course, it's so much better when we can, hey, there's the kitty. And then of course, it's so much better when we can experience that camaraderie and getting this blood pressure going up in the whole 9 yards. So I equate all this camaraderie aspect to the concept of, I would say, you know, people who want to like walk on fire. You know, you see all these groups get together and their arms around each other and they're just, and then they're wrapping their arms around each other, running on the fire, or they're running on nails. I mean, why do they do it? I mean, because of the camaraderie. They just love feeling that adrenaline and they love being a part of something. One of my all-time favorite things is, all-time saying is that you don't need to be a part of something great, but it would be great to just be a part of something. So I think that's what people look for, is to just be a part of something. You know, someone also, I had someone who we were doing a lecture for, and she just came right out and said, you know, she just loves watching the murder and the mayhem. You know, she just loves watching, you know, the Michael Myers do his thing and this and that and the whole 9 yards. And I asked her why, and she said, well, sometimes at times my life is dull. So I just love going to horror movies and see these crazy whacked out stuff, which I thought was interesting. So I think that that's an important part, and I'll share a quick story, which is have you all seen any of the Friday the 13th films or Halloween films? Okay, so I remember that when I was going to one of the Friday the 13th, there was a scene where this couple was like making out in the forest and they were in a sleeping bag. And the theater was packed, 500 people. And then Jason walks up to the sleeping bag and he zips up the sleeping bag. So there's no way for them to get out. He picks up the sleeping bag and he swings it and swings it and swings it really hard and then just bashes it against this huge tree. And all of a sudden, the whole theater is just going nuts. They're just screaming at the top of their lungs. And I'm screaming at the top of my lungs. And I ask myself, am I crazy? Are we all crazy? I don't think so. So that's just another example of like feeling that adrenaline rush. People just like to go because they love this stuff. So I think that that's, you know, part of it without question. Now, there's other areas why we love to psychologically see horror movies. And I also want to ask if anyone else can chime in or type in or let us know what some of those reasons might be, other than getting the adrenaline and feeling that like communal experience among each other. Anyone else want to take a guess at what something else what might be another reason why we love to go to see horror films? Okay, I'll throw something out there. and it has to do with a potential dark side that we might all have. Okay. All right, Heather, you're shaking, you're nodding yes. Can you tell me why you're nodding your head yes? I'm curious.
Because humans throughout history, from everything from, colonization, Spanish Inquisitions, to the earliest time, we've all seen torture. We've seen, genocides. It is a very dark part of us that a lot of people don't like to acknowledge, and horror movies allow us to acknowledge a part of us we all try to smother every day.
Right. So it's kind of like this thing that we all don't want to admit we have, but we do have. And then we like to go see it in the movie theaters because that kind of like perhaps on a like unconscious level, it fulfills that in a sense. Something like that, you think? Okay, that's a great answer. That's definitely one of the main answers. By the way, there's like 9 chat at the bottom. Rachel, I don't know what that means. Does that mean anything?
No, I'll keep you updated if somebody has an answer in there.
Okay, or if someone's asking a question. Okay, cool. So basically, I think the main thing is exactly what Heather had said, that we all want to deny that it's not there, but it is. And I think all of that has to do with like, it's the only time we can like, I guess, explore our dark side, and I guess you can say release the taboos that we have within ourselves. Like Halloween is probably the only time of the year where you can see someone walking down the street dressed as Michael Myers, and it's going to seem normal. You can walk down the street and see someone with a knife sticking out of their head and there's blood coming down, and you won't think anything twice about it. So I think that plays a definite big example. Like what I like to think of it as like, it's the best time of the year, or the only time of the year where we can express our inner ids, basically the inner id that we have in ourself of that dark side. So I think that's a real important aspect of the concept of the inner taboo, just like Heather had said. I think we all have it to a certain degree, and another reason that we like to experience it is through watching a horror film. So I think that's definitely something that that's an interesting concept. It's almost like if we go to see a movie like Carrie with Sissy Spacek, she's being mentally tortured and brutalized by these like really mean and awful high school students. I mean, everybody wants her to just totally demolish the high school students. They all want to get their comeuppance. Are you crazy for thinking that you'd like to see these people get their comeuppance in the worst way? No, I just think it's part of our inner taboo to just kind of want that, preceded by how she was being treated. So that definitely, like Heather had said, is a definite, really good answer of why we like to do that. Another potential type thing, I'm going to throw something else out there, is something having to do with it prepares us for something. That horror films can prepare us for something. And so does anyone have an idea of what I'm like trying to get at when I say that horror films prepare us? Like, how can a horror film prepare us in another aspect? How could that be beneficial?
I've heard some people say that they're motivated by watching a horror film, so that if they're ever in that situation, they'll know what not to do or what to do.
Yes, horror films can prepare us for the worst. It can prepare us for a worst case scenario. So in case we're in that position, we can say to ourselves, whatever they do, I'm not going to do. Exactly what Rachel said. So it basically like puts us in a position where, it can help us if we're in actual danger. Now, it just doesn't have to relate specifically to the same situation that's going on the screen. But if you're watching the horror film and your blood pressure's going and your heart rate is going up, and then you realize then that you are sort of in a safe environment, we talked about that before, you can then, in other situations that make you feel edgy and stressful, you can then channel how you were able to relax yourself in a horror film, those emotions, and channel that in another situation in your life as a result of what you learned through the emotions of the horror film, and you can channel that in reality. That's another interesting thing. What I also wanted to bring up is that the concept of prepper movies. Does anyone know what a prepper movie is? Has anyone ever heard of a prepper film, as in like preparation? Okay.
So like Doomsday movies?
Huh?
So like the Doomsday movies?
Yes, Doomsday, Apocalypse, virus, zombies. Believe it or not, they did studies, and people through COVID who were big fans of prepper movies, saw movies about zombies and saw movies about, you know, apocalyptic stuff, they fared better stress-wise during COVID than people who did not watch the prepper horror films, prepper action horror films. They did studies about that, which I think is really interesting. And people who actually psychologically, who were a big fan of those kinds of films, fared better in COVID. And I think that also has another element to do with how it prepares us. That goes hand in hand with how it prepares us. So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, the other way has to do with resilience, and they kind of like go hand in hand in a sense, because what all this does is that it enables us to create a toolkit to how to survive in these situations. It's basically like when we experience anxiety and we're afraid, we can use this toolkit to get us through these situations. And one of my all-time favorite quotes is from Stephen King, who said that sometimes people make up horror so they can cope with the real horror in their lives. And that's another reason why they go to see horror films, so they can see this made-up horror and get through this, and then they can channel those emotions, and they can basically, you know, look within themselves and perhaps utilize those emotions to get out of the terrible situation that they have in whatever capacity in their daily real lives. So I think that resilience is a real important aspect of how we can prepare ourselves through watching the horror film psychologically. So let's talk about the last one, and then, well, actually not the last one, but another one, and then we're going to get into the evolution and Silence of the Lambs. And that is that, do you think horror in any sense contributes, or how could horror in a sense boost our, what could it have to do with our intellect? Is there any element where they go hand in hand with one's intellect when we're watching like a horror film, for example, of how it could help it, how it could hurt it? You want to take a stab at that, perhaps? Yeah, Sanaa. Sanaa.
I just so I know a lot of times if I'm watching a horror movie, I like very quickly, like I sort of try to like figure out what's going on. If you don't know like who the killer is, something like that. Just, I feel like when you're watching it, it's very immersive and your brain is sort of firing on all cylinders as you try to like put all the puzzle pieces together.
Excellent. Exactly. You're being like a detective. And what do? What part of the brain does that signify when we're doing it? What part of the brain are we doing? What type of performance? Well, we're working with concentration. We're reasoning. We're trying to figure out who's doing what. We're learning what's going on, and then we can use the reasoning to try to figure out what the next thing is going to happen. We're talking about all these elements that we use brain performance for, whether it's the reasoning, whether it's the concentration, whether it's learning, whether it's memory, you know, we can always remember it later. So believe it or not, an interesting aspect of horror films is that yes, it can boost intellect because you're using that part of the brain in a horror film that you use in your everyday life. It's just in a different scenario. So that's absolutely true. Um, and 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 I think that that's one of the very important things. You wouldn't think that's true. I mean, people wouldn't think that that's true, but it is actually very much true. Now, of course, there are potential negatives with horror films. I think we all know this. A potential negative, obviously, might be something like, people have nightmares and things like that. People after watching Friday the 13th, they may never go in the woods again. I'll be totally honest. After I saw Jaws, for about 6 months, I tried to spend as much time on the toilet as possible because I thought the shark was going to come out of the toilet and bite me on the ass. That's actually a true story. I was really afraid of the shark. It doesn't matter what water was around me. Okay, I was afraid of water. Doesn't matter if it was in the sea or on the toilet, the whole 9 yards. So I think that is a couple other important aspects of. And do you think that there's other aspects that horror films have negative, like between nightmares and things like that? We'd love to get your take on something like that.
Yes, because if you become too immersed into them and you put yourself in a singleized viewpoint, you stop looking at all the clues maybe the director's leaving around you and becoming just like the character in an almost instinctual response.
Okay.
So, you're picking up their panic, you're picking up, lash out, scream, run, instead of, the guy that's been chasing you for the last 2 hours is knocked out on the floor, just kill him and then run away, just seal the deal here.
Right, and so how would that affect you? Like, how would that affect your brain and your mind psychologically?
You're relying more on the instinct than actual reasoning, because your flight is an act instead of saying, okay, he's down, let's secure him, and then we can run.
Right.
You're gone.
So it's like your fight or flight is an overdrive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Really good. And that's what I meant when I said that for a moment, if the horror film is doing its job, you might actually think it's really happening. And that's, I think, what happens in that example. So that's a definite good example. Rachel, did you have a comment you wanted to say?
Kelly has her hand raised. Kelly, take it away.
Yeah, I don't know if there's studies out there. I work with victims of child abuse, and we have speculated that, a lot of your horror movies, the victim is, attractive girl, half clothed, and she's the one that gets terrorized or tortured or killed. And the increase in sexual violence may be contributed some to desensitization by horror movies by equating sex with bad things such as killing, maiming, horror, which I'm a huge fan of horror movies, but I just think that might be one of the negative impacts of horror.
Right. I definitely think that's and as a result, then how do they express that? What do they do sometimes in your experience?
I've been doing this for a lot of years, and it's just that we are just seeing more victims of sexual abuse, and a lot of the sexual abuse with the younger perpetrators takes a more, like, sexual abuse in itself is bad, but you're seeing more of a violence turn, more of a threats, more acceptance of, like, the peers that have seen it,
Right.
not reporting because they kind of accept that rape as a not as bad of things like if it had happened 50 years ago, kind
Right.
of thing.
So you think like the male peers who are going to see the film take it out like that, just as they see on screen?
Yeah, and I mean the females don't report either. That witness it.
Right.
I think it's just a generalized desensitization.
Yeah, and that's definitely like one of the negatives of horror films, that you do have people who are watching this stuff. It's kind of like video games, for example.
Right. I mean, they can be safe for them. Yes.
Right. Exactly. That's definitely a great point. Another aspect also, and I think that brings up a really great point, which has to do with the psychology of horror films from the point of view. Thank you for bringing that up, Kelly, because that's a great lead into my next point, which is horror films might have one thought process on one person versus another thought process on another. So taking it to an extreme and in a horrific way is what Kelly was saying. But then again, you know, there's someone else who is demonstrating it in the way that's the more safe way, which is a lot of the stuff that we were talking about before. Now, there's also someone in between, for example, case in point, and I thought this was really interesting, and that is that in a previous lecture I did, I was talking about Friday the 13th and the character of Jason. And what was interesting is that I had asked for hands to be raised as to, you know, what are some of their favorite horror films, and a lot of people said Friday the 13th. And this one person raised his hand, and it's not like he was a adolescent. I mean, he was probably in his like 30s or 40s. And he says, well, I don't really see Friday the 13th as a horror film. I said, really? Elaborate, please. He says, well, I really think that it was a movie about a child who had some mommy issues. I see it more of a drama. Yes, yes. And I'm looking at this guy and I'm saying, a drama, really? Mommy issues. Okay, well, you know, that's kind of an interesting concept. I'm thinking to myself, you know, just wait until this guy leaves, you know, so he doesn't like see me leave. I don't know what this guy's going to do. But I mean, that was, I thought, was just a little bit too much for me. And I thought that was kind of, I mean, it was interesting, but it kind of goes hand in hand with what I was talking about, where, you know, just because, you know, what's disturbing to one person on some level might have a different effect as to what's disturbing to someone on another level. So if you have the first factor of what we were talking about, the safe ways to interpret horror, and then you might have this person's point of view that thinks that Jason is a drama and he had some issues with his family, you know, hopefully he's not doing anything that is illegal. I don't think he is. And then of course you sort of like go from there, and you have what Kelly was talking about, which is the worst case scenario. So I think there's definitely, like, you know, what's disturbing to someone on whatever that level that is different to the level of what is disturbing to someone also. Now, what I want to do now is I want to get into now the concept, and this is part of what the lecture is, because we're talking Silence of the Lambs here, to talk about how Silence of the Lambs was such a huge contributing factor to how horror evolved, in terms of how horror evolved from what it was, which was from, you know, the Jason movies and the Friday the 13th and the Nightmare on Elm Street. And then what happened after that? How did it change? Well, it had to change because there was all this like slasher high school horror that was just been there, done that. And producers knew that they had to evolve it into something much more sophisticated and much more intelligent, which is how we got into what's called psychological horror, which is a lot different than like a regular horror film. You know, people basically, you know, when they watched a horror film, people knew, producers, directors, writers, that horror, yes, was so unique as opposed to all genres, in the sense that it's not really something that we just go to. The original producer of Halloween had, I think, a really great motto, and he called Halloween theater of the mind. And what that means is that it's always best to have the audience, not through gore and shock value, but through perhaps what maybe is not seen on the screen, rather have that than buckets of blood. That's far more effective. And Halloween was way ahead of its time for that aspect of horror, because I don't know if you remember Halloween, but there was no blood. After Michael Myers killed someone, there was no blood after that. He just would do the thing with the knife and that was it. And that was very interesting. That was way ahead of its time. As they say with horror films, what made it so successful is that you not only watch a horror film, you experience it. That's an interesting, I think, a real interesting concept over any genre. And obviously you experience it for some of the reasons we talked about before. But when I say that there was no blood and we talk about no buckets of blood is far more horrific, because it enables the viewer to imagine what's on the screen rather than be forced to see what's on the screen. So they had to do that in order to evolve, because everyone was experiencing gore burnout. No one wanted to see this stuff anymore. You know, they wanted to pull together and do more things because the splatter fans were basically unimpressed. And how did they do it? Well, they came about by doing it a couple different ways. And Silence of the Lambs, I think, is one of the best movies that demonstrates this. And that is that one of the biggest aspects of Silence of the Lambs, one of the most successful things about it, is that, and it's so far different than like in Halloween or Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger, or Jason from Friday the 13th. Those are, like, to me, both a protagonist and especially villain cartoon characters. But horror evolved heavily into what we call thriller as a result of one of the most important things, which is three-dimensional characters. And I think that's a major, major important aspect. If you look at a movie like Michael Myers, for example, or Jason or things like that, you know, the villains are really not three-dimensional. You know, they're just kind of like, as I said, cartoon characters. So we really don't know much about them as a result. But if you then look at something like Silence of the Lambs, which is, I think, one of the quintessential thrillers, is that it's obviously so necessary in a movie to have a great villain, a really creepy villain. But it begs the question, how much should we know about the villain? How interesting should the villain be? And this goes hand in hand with another reason why I think people love thrillers, especially psychological thrillers and horror films, is because the fascination people have with evil. The fascination people have with the criminal mind. Why people do these crazy, insane things. And in movies, when you have all these monsters, I believe that the closer the monster is to evil, the more interesting the monster is to us as an audience. The more deep relationship that monster has with evil, the more interesting they are as a character, and that makes us much more interesting in them, hence interested in the film. So if you take a character, for example, like Jamie Gumb. Have we seen Silence of the Lambs? Raise your hand if you've seen Silence of the Lambs. Okay, so.
I've seen bits and pieces of it, but I've never seen it start to finish.
Okay, it's a brilliant movie. But what I'm getting at is that if you take a character like Jamie Gumb, for example, who played Buffalo Bill, who was the serial killer, committing all these horrific murders. The actor who played that, Ted Levine, he was commenting on, he knew that a typical serial killer in the movies had similar characteristics. They wanted to control women. They were powerless. They were, in their lives, they were just ineffectual. They weren't useful. All these different traits. And that was like a stereotype. But with Jamie Gumb, he got so into that character because what his character was is that he was killing women and then de-skinning them so he could build a woman's suit. And so in his mind, he just didn't want to control women. He wanted to become a woman. And that's what his character was. He wanted to possess that godlike element that a woman has. And he wanted to have that for himself. And he just got so into that aspect of not only just the stereotype, but so much more. And that was so truly evil. And what makes that so interesting is that, you know, you might think that a movie like that wasn't was just fiction, when in reality it's not. Silence of the Lambs character, Jamie Gumb, was based on a real life character, which was actually based on Psycho. So for example, in Psycho, Anthony Perkins' character, he wanted to dress as his mother because he had a split personality and one was his mother. Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, he wanted to be a woman. So you have that both wanting to be a woman concept. Psycho was based on a real person named Ed Gein, who was back in the 70s and the 80s, a Wisconsin serial killer who was completely deranged, named Ed Gein. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the concept of Jamie Gumb skimming the victims to build a woman suit. Ed Gein, as horrific as this sounds, he also skinned his victims, but he then put the skin and used them as lampshades, if you can believe that. Completely horrifying. So my point is that some of these characters, to get to true evil, it might not necessarily just be fiction. It can actually come from reality, which in this case it does, that I thought was like really interesting. And it doesn't necessarily, for example, it doesn't necessarily have to come from just real people. You can get an evil aspect. In other words, if you know yourself that you're evil in this film, you don't necessarily base your evilness on someone who was pure evil. You can get traits from a perfectly decent other human being. Anthony Hopkins, for example, he actually, when he was going to acting school in London, he, from his professor, one of his main professors, he said that this guy was a charismatic, super intelligent gentleman, but he was sharp as a tack. But this guy was one son of a bitch, where Anthony Hopkins would do a performance, and if this guy didn't like the performance, he would just give Anthony Hopkins the business. And no, you this, you that, you this, you that. But he had such a gentlemanly, charismatic way about how he did it that was so unique. Well, I want to ask someone out there who saw Silence of the Lambs, what character in Silence of the Lambs, who was obviously a complete psychopath, but yet did possess an element of charisma and was to a degree a gentleman and was respectful? Does anyone want to take a guess at that?
I mean,
Yes.
Hannibal Lecter.
Yes, exactly. Hannibal Lecter. He saw Hannibal Lecter as a gentleman. He saw him as very charismatic. And let's face it, I mean, the guy was, having the faults of, killing and eating people. Listen, you know what? We all have our faults. What can I tell you? But this guy had those elements to him. He was charismatic. He was a gentleman. He was respectful of Jodie Foster's character. But oh man, he actually liked to say to himself, he killed people so differently than Jamie Gumb. Jamie Gumb was on impulse. Hannibal Lecter did it in sort of a relaxing, quick, deadly way. Jamie Gumb, no, too impulse. It took too long for him to kill people, and he terrorized them. No, Hannibal Lecter was much more gentlemanly. This is how he created that character for himself. But it started with that professor that I thought was real interesting, that he took some of those traits from a perfectly sane person, and he applied that into his character. So that is one of the main reasons why that movie was so successful, and how horror films have evolved, because the characters were so far unique than what these other horror movies back in the 70s and 80s were. They were so far three-dimensional. Another thing that they were is that, let's take, for example, it's a no-brainer in any film that you need a good villain. You got to have a great, crazy, psychotic villain. That's just the way that it has to be. But not only is it really hard to get a really good villain, you got to have a kick-ass hero, a kick-ass protagonist. And what was a better protagonist than Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs? So from the psychology aspect, you have Jodie Foster, who is an FBI trainee in training, and she's put on this assignment by her boss to get information from Hannibal Lecter on Buffalo Bill. And in her eyes, psychologically, she needs to do this. It becomes to the point where if she can save the senator's daughter who was kidnapped, that will stop the lambs from screaming in her mind. Because if you remember, when she was a child growing up, she would work on the farm with her dad before he died. And she grew up where there were lambs, and the lambs were being slaughtered, and it put her in such a horrible place. And she sees this as, if she can save the senator's daughter, then yes, that will help the lambs or stop the lambs from screaming. Just an awesome psychological character trait. And when you combine that with, you have not only protagonists, you have not only antagonists, but you have connecting those two, what is their relationship? You know, it's one thing where the protagonist is, all their job is to find the murderer. And then it's one thing if the murderer's job is to just be the killer. But what if you can blend them together in such an interesting, crazy, somewhat diabolical, but brilliant way? So you not only have a great protagonist, a great antagonist, but you have an amazing relationship between these characters. How he is basically, I mean, think about it. Anthony Hopkins is not only the person who is going to help her through this, he's also, to a degree, a father figure, in a sense. He's a father figure to Jodie Hopkins, to Jodie Foster, Clarice Starling. How he can get through, how he like talks her through these. She realizes that the lambs will stop if she can solve this case. He makes her realize that. He's a father figure to her. He's a mentor to her. How amazing is that? The character that he was, their relationship is so amazing and so well thought out, which goes hand in hand with how horror has also evolved into the thriller, which is not only the kinds of characters that we have, such three-dimensional characters, but the situations these people are in, the reality of who these people are. They're not just like someone who's walking in the woods and getting killed. They're not just high school students walking home from school and getting killed. In Jodie Foster's, she's an FBI agent in training. Yes, we have Buffalo Bill the murderer, of course, okay? But Anthony Hopkins, how interesting is he, being the cannibal that he is, but yet he is also, who's this killer, also helping Jodie Foster through this. That's his character. That's who he is. The past of him being a cannibal and a killer, and he's a psychiatrist. How interesting is that? So these are real everyday people in these crazy, horrific situations. And they can be in so many different other thrillers. They can be other types of real people. So let me just go over this. Like, what are some of your favorite thriller horror movies? And I can name a couple right off the bat, but I want you to kind of get in on this. That like in like the 70s or the early 80s or something, what were some really great horror films, horror thrillers? Movies that had three-dimensional characters. They were real people with real jobs, and they had real problems, but they just they took these things, the writers took it to the end of the earth and created these horrific situations. But the movies themselves were terrifying.
Stephen King's The Stand.
Oh, The Stand, yeah, okay, yeah.
It's a little later, but one of my first was Stephen King, Rose Red.
Okay, and can you give me an example of taking that beyond the horror? What was three-dimensional in that? What were some of the important reasons of what kind of characters did they seem real? Who were they?
I really, and it's been a long time since I've seen it.
Yeah.
But the main protagonist, she was a professor that supernatural at a university, and everyone was trying to cut her budget. So she was determined to go to this haunted house and prove the truth. So it
Yeah.
became almost an obsession. It was her versus herself, because she needed to prove not only to the other professors that this was true, but that, everything she had put into her life up to this point wasn't worthless.
Right.
And then I guess he was like a boyfriend, he had grown up in the house and he had seen the hauntings. So, it was the emotional growth of him, what was a
Okay.
child's fear versus what was actually happening. And just these building of, her fighting herself, her fighting everyone else, him fighting himself, him eventually fighting back against the house. I thought it really made it three-dimensional because, it's not just monster chasing through
Right.
the house.
Right.
It's an
Exactly.
emotional growth.
Right. So the emotional aspect of it. So it felt like that it was like almost like real people versus like a cartoon. Okay, that's very good. Let me give you another example. Three of my favorites. The Rosemary's Baby, for example. Anyone seen Rosemary's Baby? Raise your hand. Very good. Great movie about, and I'm sure you remember it, but what was so interesting is that, what was the lead character's name? I forget his name. But Mia Farrow and her husband, I forget what his name was, it's escaping me, but he was an actor, the person in the film. And he was, and they both move into this new mansion, apartment, house kind of thing where see Ben Gazzara, I think Ben Gazzara, where you think supposedly everything is great with all these neighbors, and I think Ruth Buzzy in it. I think Ruth Buzzy was in it, or Ruth Gordon, I forget. But you think all these people are wonderful and everyone's great. Well, all of a sudden, Ben Gazzara's character is having all these problems in auditions, and he can't go anywhere. And what you then don't know is that the people in the house are actually devil worshippers, Satan worshippers. And they then do something to the person who had gotten one of the roles that Ben Gazzara didn't get. And as a result, Ben Gazzara gets that role. So he basically sold himself to the devil so he could get these roles, so he could get these better roles. And then as a result, that in return, the devil then impregnates Mia Farrow's character to have a child or have the devil. I'm not exactly sure 100% how it worked, but I mean, you talk about like, these like real people like Ben Gazzara and Mia Farrow in these terrible situations, and he in this terrible situation, and then all of a sudden, that's just taken way, to the next level of horror and reality, where he makes this deal as a result of the devil, where he'll get better roles if his wife gets impregnated in the Satan aspect. I mean, that's horrific, totally horrific. And it was just really terrifying because you just, she's always going to the same doctor after getting pregnant, and there's always something off about the doctor, but you just know these are just real people in real situations, but it's just taken way out there to the next level. And that's what I mean by that. They can be residents in an apartment. They can be exactly what you said regarding the Stephen King film. They can be doctors. They can be people running for Congress. They can be like, for example, a mother who's got a child and she doesn't know what to do because she thinks that she's possessed. And what does she do? It's horrible. Well, guess what? That's The Exorcist, which again to me is one of my all-time favorite horror movies. A woman who's going through this horrific situation with her daughter. Also, The Omen, Gregory Peck, and their son is the devil, the 666, and how horrible that must be for them. A real person going through this horrible crisis and all these horrific things happening all over the place. Three-dimensional characters, real people, real situations, and that's how, as a result, horror really evolved. because everyone was so much more real. The characters were so much more thought out. The scripts were so much more sophisticated. The movies were so much more sophisticated. And that's a reason why you really don't see a lot of really good thrillers nowadays, really, if any, is because they are so hard to write well. And it's really hard to do that. So I think that that's like another really strong example of how horror has evolved. And the differences between horror, what horror was, and how it evolved into like the psychological and the thriller aspect, because it's much more sophisticated. So I see it's like 8:08, 8:10, and I know that the lecture was from like 7 to 8. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Or, I tried to cover as quickly as I could of the main topics of the psychology, the positive aspects of the psychology, the negative, the evolvement of horror and how it came to thriller. So if there's any comments or thoughts or criticisms, whatever you want to do, I'm from the East Coast, I can take anything.
Sorry. So would you say the true transition to horror thriller was the introduction of man versus man?
Expand on that a little bit.
So we're going from very two-dimensional villains, Michael Myers,
Yeah.
Freddy Krueger, who could be considered more monster than man at that point,
Right.
to, Silence of the Lambs, The Omen, where it's human versus
inner?
human. Hmm.
Like inner conflict, man versus man, inner. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely that's a strong part of it. That takes it completely to the next level of the example that you were saying. And what was it again? Ruby, what was it? Ruby what?
Rose red or red rose? Yeah, rose red.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that when we have like inner conflicts, that makes it so much more psychological. The thing is the psychological concept of it. That's where it really, took off, when people realized that you needed to make things psychological and have people have these inner conflicts within themselves. So Jodie Foster had an inner conflict because of the horror that she was going through about the lambs. And the inner conflict within her was that she was trying to figure out how she could make it stop. And that was great. Jamie Gum, he wanted to be a woman, and which is a tremendous inner conflict, but it's like it's deep-seated and it's so psychological and it's just so unique. So definitely, I think that in so many different antagonists, they have within themselves a conflict that makes them so much more three-dimensional versus the fear that versus the other conflict that they have, which is to the outside world. So I think it's definitely both that makes it a really strong, what makes great character is definitely both of those, the outer, exterior and interior conflict. So absolutely.
You have piqued my interest. Do tell about the demographics of horror film viewers.
Ah, yeah, who is that?
Oh, that's me.
Okay. Well, what's interesting regarding a horror film is that they have statistics, obviously, demographics, male, female, and age range. So it goes by gender and age range, and the industry goes by the ages of 4 brackets. One is 12 to 24. One is 25 to 40, 40 to 65, and then 65 plus. So if I was to throw out there, male or female, and what is the age bracket of the demographic, what do you think horror films fall into? What is the number one demographic?
Male 25 to 40.
Okay, good answer. Anyone else? Savannah?
I would have guessed what Rachel said, so.
Okay, Heather?
Yeah, I'm gonna go same. Well, I guess my problem is it depends on if you're gonna specialize.
No.
So then, yeah, I just stick with the same.
Okay, so what's interesting is that if you look right now, at least the only thing that I can see now is that separate from Rachel and myself, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 female, and I believe 2 male on this lecture right now. But most interesting thing about it is that the number one demographic is females 12 to 24. That is the number one demographic of horror films. I mean, they go nuts. They just love it. I think part of the concept is also of horror is a great date night movie. They just love going to the theater, screaming, holding on to their friends and their, partners in the whole 9 yards, boyfriends, girlfriends. They just go crazy. So that I definitely think is probably something that a lot of people didn't expect, but that is the highest demographic of what a horror film is. And before we go, I don't want to forget this. I know we talked a lot about movies per se. There's also some interesting cable stuff of psychological horror that I think is really interesting. And one is a show called, I think it's on Netflix, called Mindhunter, Mindhunter, if anyone's ever heard of it. It takes place in the 70s before we really knew anything about serial killers. And it focuses on, this part of the, I think it's the CIA or FBI, I forget which one, that these 2 criminal guys who were trying to create this program to find more things about serial killers, and they go to these different, to meet these different serial killers to learn more about them. But what's interesting is that the characters, it's obviously actors, but the actors are playing the roles of the serial killers. So they go and they talk to the BTK killer to learn more about why he did what he did, which was does anyone know what the serial killer BTK? Do you know what the BTK stood for?
It's bound, tie, and I forgot the K.
Kill.
I thought it was bound. I thought it was bound, torture.
Oh, it might be bound, torture, and kill. You're right.
Yeah, bound, torture, kill. Not pleasant at all. That was BTK. And they go to BTK and they talk to his character, and that was really interesting. And they also talk to Charles Manson and all these other people. But it's a real interesting show that focuses on the evolution of how we came to have criminal profiling programs by the FBI or CIA, headed by people like John Douglas. Just why people do things, getting back to what we talked about of the fascination with evil, to me is just fascinating. And I think that's something that we'll always want to know. Not everyone, obviously, but I think that there's a lot out there that are interested in the criminal mind and why people become like this. So, but Mindhunter is definitely a good show. And of course, if anyone knows, a good thriller that they've seen, versus a TV show, please let me know. I'd like to know if anyone can recommend something.
We've got The Haunting of Hill House as a suggestion in the chat.
Thank you, Savannah. The Haunting of Hill House. I can recommend just a couple of quick others that I thought were real interesting. Al Pacino in Sea of Love. I thought that was a really good, whodunit thriller. Shattered, starring Tom Berenger. I thought that was really, really good too. I would kind of recommend that. And yeah, so those are just kind of like quick examples. But if you haven't seen Silence of the Lambs, definitely Heather, I recommend you check it out. It's just a great example. And it's a Best Picture award winner. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, as well as director, as well as for Hopkins and Foster. They both won Best Actor and Actress, as well as the writing, and I believe it won for cinematography. So yeah, it's got a slew of awards. Just a brilliant, brilliant piece of writing and directing also. Just a brilliant cinematic experience. I also teach a class on the cinematic aspect of Silence of the Lambs, where I go through all the choices the director and the cinematographer chose to take that script and put it on the screen. And it's like there's nothing that was done by accident. everything was mapped out perfectly. All the camera movements and the angles and this and that. Because, you don't see it, you don't have people saying a movie like Silence of the Lambs is brilliant just because of the writing. I mean, it's got to be because of what the director did with the choosing of all the camera angles and everything, the technical aspect. So I have a big class that I talk about that. So I definitely recommend that you see it for all different, both the creative aspect as the acting aspect, as well as the cinematic aspect.
And if you haven't seen it, I did put the link so that you can check out The Silence of the Lambs. That's in the chat. So you can do that. And if you're watching this recording, that will be in the video description. So you can always check out that DVD from the library.
And does anybody want to share, maybe they did before, but before we go, why they like horror films? I mean, if you do like horror films, because I'd be curious if any of those aspects fell into the concepts that we were talking about, or was it a different thing? I mean, does anyone want to just kind of throw in something on that, typing or saying it or anything like that? I know, Heather, you mentioned the rush, the adrenaline. So I'm always looking for like other stuff too.
As I talk, I deal with pretty horrific stories day to day.
Yeah.
And like when John first told me about this class, he said he doesn't send people who like horror movies because he didn't. And I said, well, like you had said earlier, it's easier to face real live monsters when you have these make-believe monsters on TV.
And so from that perspective, like, why is it easier to look at the make-believe? Like, how does that help you cope with the real life monster?
Because you can do your, like with the real, when I'm working with these children, I can't show emotion. But when I'm watching a horror movie, I can.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of gives you that resilience to be able to hold up to it.
And that's you, but what about the person themselves who have the horror in their lives themselves? How do you think they would relate to that, like by making up the horror or seeing it on the screen that helps them?
Like you said before, everybody's individual. Like not everyone in my career field likes horror movies. It's just, how, because they go to counseling, we send them to counseling to help get their resilience up. But
interesting.
Yeah.
And so maybe seeing it on the screen, like we had talked about, can help them navigate, channel that emotion that they're feeling in the safe environment toward real life. I mean, I think that's an important aspect of it. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great, and it's great that you brought that up from your perspective, because it can be from both the person who's experiencing the horror versus someone like yourself. So that's awesome. Okay. Anyone else?
Personally, I like a lot of the supernatural, low budget movies, up and coming directors, because they don't get to rely on the gore or the superior, oh my gosh, it's big name actor. They can't lean on that. Mm-hmm. So they have to develop more into the storytelling. Mm-hmm. And so I find a lot of, more supernatural stories, they have to build that drama. They have to build all of that in the actual plot line of the movie instead of.
So it's not the blood that you see, it's what you don't see that you find more interesting. That's a great point. I mean, if you talk about like Silence of the Lambs, for example, forgetting in the whole movie, can anyone name anyone that was on screen getting killed by Buffalo Bill, Jamie Gumb in Silence of the Lambs? Do you remember anyone on screen getting killed? And the answer is no. No one on screen got killed by Jamie Gumb. It was all stuff that you heard about, that you heard about them. And I thought that was a real interesting, and that also, Heather, goes hand in hand with when you talk about what you don't see is more effective than buckets of blood. That also has to do with the psychology of the killer, him or herself. For example, yes, we knew a lot about Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, but how much did we really know about? Oh, actually, I mean, actually asking this to the wrong person because you haven't seen the film. But actually, someone brought up something, Kelly, that's actually true. I'm going to talk, I'll mention that. But my point is that in Silence of the Lambs, we really don't know much about the killer, whose name is Buffalo Bill. And to go hand in hand with what you said of not seeing the buckets of blood and imagining, that goes hand in hand with not knowing much about the killer, because it enabled us to sort of just be even more creeped out because we didn't know anything about that person, of why they were doing what they were doing. And psychologically, that made us more sort of like frightened because we didn't know anything about them. Does that make sense? And so that made it a much more effective character. Now, had there been, throughout the film, had we been more aware of who they were, you know, maybe we would have been a little more sympathetic. But the writers didn't want that. They wanted us to be completely creeped out. Hence, the reason of why we weren't shown much about their, what they call backstory, that we weren't given that information. So that's another example of what you don't see or what you don't hear enables you to imagine something that's more horrific than what you're actually shown to see. And Kelly was saying, and this is true, in Halloween, the Michael Myers mask was actually branded off of William Shatner from Star Trek. They took his face and they made the Michael Myers mask, which I thought was very interesting. Well, all right. Well, thank you very much for everybody being here. I hope, you know what I like? I always do this to my students. I want someone, and I always take a chance doing this, but I'm going to do it. I just want someone to tell me one thing that they didn't know that they found of interest tonight that they learned. So Heather, can you just tell me just at least one thing that perhaps was that you found somewhat interesting?
The demographics were surprising to me,
Okay.
but also how you explained like the true evil in more ways of just, you know, man versus man.
Mm-hmm. In what sense, like true evil, like other types of evil, or you mean the evil man, the inner man versus man could also be evil, like in, yeah, okay, gotcha. All right, Savannah, you want to throw one in there?
Sure. I mean, yeah, to just sort of go off what Heather said, the demographics stuff really surprised me, but also I am relatively new to watching horror films, so it's been really interesting for me to learn more about sort of the transition from horror and into thriller and how that sort of intertwines with one another.
Okay, great. I hope you enjoyed it. I really do. All right, great. Well, that's, as I say to my students, bon voyage.
So you're probably wondering, what now? Now there's some more resources that you can look into. So we've got a list of books here. If you're watching the recording, the links to check these books out is in the description. I will also be sending out this to everyone who registered for this event. So a few on actual horror movies and digging into some of those more psychological aspects as well. And then of course, some books that the horror movies are based off of. We've got all of those available through the library. You can also watch horror and thriller movies on Hoopla. Just search in the search box for horror or thriller and limit your search by movies. That's a great way to check out some more movies. And of course, it's all free with your library card. If you don't already have your library card, be sure to apply for an electronic library card. You can get your e-card started right away. Just go to greenvillelibrary.org/get-a-card. So that's a great way to get started. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. That's also a wonderful way to keep in touch with what events are going on. You can see some great pictures. We have a wonderful social media expert who keeps us up to date on everything that's going on in the library system. If you have any questions, you can email asklibrarian@greenvillelibrary.org to get in touch with a reference librarian. So if you want to do more research on horror films, they're great to check out. You can also email me at explore@greenvillelibrary.org if you have any questions related to events. As always, we say your library can be 24/7 just by accessing the website. So not only do we have the events page, we also have an adult virtual activities page. That's where you can watch more recordings like this one, and you can also do some online activities or request kits. So we always have something going on at the library for you. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, of course, to Jeffrey Cooper for sharing his time and talent. And we hope that you have a wonderful evening tonight.